There's an old saying about lies, damn lies, and statistics. And in today's episode, Greg's going to demonstrate exactly why that's a saying. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. And we're just getting started in Chapter 16, where Greg is attempting to debunk various criticisms of Christianity, which is what he calls his just the facts, ma'am tactic. And in Greg's mind, that apparently includes defending the idea that America is a Christian nation. But we'll get to that in just a minute. First, Greg has some advice on how to persuade folks. Quote, I want you to notice something about the facts I cited in the examples about conflict caused by secular ideologies. They were as precise as I could make them without being cumbersome. Precision is an important element of just the facts, ma'am, because of a basic principle of persuasion. When citing facts in your defense, precise claims are always more persuasive than general ones. End quote. And unfortunately, this is true. Human folks has an unfortunate tendency to mistake precision for conclusiveness, at least when it comes to folks making questionable claims. For example, Greg has just got done claiming that quote-unquote secular ideologies was responsible for killing more than 66 million Soviets under the communists, between 32 and 61 million Chinese, and 2.7 million Khmers. Now, those numbers is precise enough that a lot of Greg's audience is going to be so impressed that they completely overlook a far more important fact, namely that those deaths weren't caused by atheism at all. Precise details is a handy and effective trick for misdirecting folks' attention and pulling a fast one. Of course, Greg don't explain it in those terms. He'd rather have us believe that his use of precise details is persuasive just cause he's right. But those of us on the skeptical side need to be vigilant and aware of the fact that using precise details works just as well to persuade folks of claims that ain't true as it does to document valid claims. It ain't a question of how precise your claims is, it's a question of telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Greg goes on to illustrate his point with a story about a time when he publicly defended Christian nationalism against Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Garry Wills. Quote, Professor Wills disputed the idea that the founding fathers of our republic were Christians. They were not Christians, he claimed, but deists. End quote. And notice how Greg cites precise details that distract from the important questions involved rather than answering them. Quote, the phrase founding fathers refers to a specific group, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. Among the 55 delegates were 28 Episcopalians, 8 Presbyterians, 7 Congregationalists, 2 Lutherans, 2 Dutch Reformed, 2 Methodists, 2 Roman Catholics, 1 unknown, and only 3 deists, Williamson, Wilson, and Franklin. End quote. And that's an impressive census, but what does it really tell us about the sincere religious views of the men who actually wrote the U.S. Constitution? Well, not as much as Greg would like to imply. There's a number of social and or political reasons why someone in 18th century America might want to identify with some particular religious denomination or other, independently of their own personal beliefs. But Greg would like us to think they was all Christian nationalists like himself. Then there's the question of how accurate Greg's reporting is. Modern scholars like Irvin Brandt regard James Madison as a deist in his personal convictions, and it's well documented that Madison was at least a champion of religious freedom to a degree that's incompatible with Christian nationalism. And yet, Madison, the famous father of the Constitution, does not appear in Greg's list of deists, nor does Alexander Hamilton, one of our most important founding fathers. Now, he may have had a possible deathbed conversion, but he was a deist prior to his duel with Aaron Burr. And of course, Greg's discussion omits any mention of the most famous deist of all, Thomas Jefferson. And while Jefferson did not personally attend the Constitutional Convention, it'd be historically naive to claim he didn't have any influence on it. That's an important historical fact that Greg is obscuring by using precise but misleading details. The important thing about the Founding Fathers ain't what they was on paper, it's what they put on paper. And one of the things they pointedly did not put on paper was anything about America being any kind of a Christian nation, to the point that a lot of Christians back then was claiming that it was an insult to God. The only thing the original Constitution said about religion was Article 6, which said that you can't have any religious test as a requirement for holding office. And that, on the face of it, is an explicit rejection of Christian nationalism. Though we'll see how long that holds up under the current administration. Anyways, enough about that. Let's move on. For his next great debunking, Greg turns his attention to a student newspaper. Quote, a piece written by a student in a university newspaper claimed that pro-lifers have no right to oppose abortion unless they are willing to care for the children born to mothers in crisis pregnancies. End quote. And of course, Greg ain't including the actual quote from the article he's replying to. That's just his own personal summary of what he thought the student was trying to say. So have a grain of salt handy. And this, by the way, is the flip side of Greg's just the facts ma'am tactic. Instead of providing precise details like the name of the newspaper, the date of publication, and an exact quote from the article, he's being deliberately vague and omitting the precise details in order to minimize the persuasiveness of the student's editorial. It's entirely possible, for example, that the student's original piece was attacking the hypocrisy of the pro-life movement's tendency to oppose federal funding for things like food stamps, prenatal care, and daycare for the kids of single moms, and so on. Now, that would have been a much stronger case, but that ain't what Greg reports. His summary of the student's editorial is optimized for the rebuttal he's about to give. Quote, it simply does not follow that because a person objects to killing innocent children, he's obliged to care for those who survive. Imagine how bizarre it would sound to argue, you have no right to stop me from beating my wife unless you are willing to marry her, end quote. Greg's trying to make this point sound as unreasonable as possible, but in fact, the argument ain't as grotesque as he's trying to make it sound. We live in a society that simply fails to provide adequate care for single moms, and that even shames women for being single mothers. And given the tendency of pro-lifers to oppose any improvements to that situation, it's hypocritical at best for them to try and force even more women to become single mothers. In fact, it's downright reprehensible. And the fact that they're using blood libel to try and force women to carry unwanted pregnancies only makes it worse. But anyways, here's where Greg's just the facts ma'am tactic kicks in. Quote, a short trip to the internet revealed that at that time there were roughly 4,000 national and international pro-life service providers dedicated to the well-being of mothers in crisis pregnancies who choose life for their children. They provide medical aid, housing, baby clothing, cribs, food, help with adoption, and even post-abortion counseling services, all at no cost. End quote. And that sounds impressive until you start digging deeper into Greg's claim, which, by the way, he does not document by providing any links or search terms we could use to look up his sources. But we can start by looking up what it takes to set up a crisis pregnancy center. And the answer is not much. You have to set up a 501c3 nonprofit organization, fill out the necessary paperwork, and have 3 people to sit on the board. And that's it. You don't even need a medical license unless you're offering medical services, which in most cases means just having an ultrasound. The trouble is, so-called crisis pregnancy centers is notorious for disinformation, emotional manipulation, and proselytizing. The free stuff is bait to attract unfortunate women in desperate need of medical, financial, and emotional support. But they ain't there to provide qualified, licensed medical care, and they definitely ain't going to give out any referrals for abortions, even to save the life of the mother. Instead, they's going to serve up a heaping helping of indoctrination and emotional manipulation designed to drive the woman to carry her pregnancy to term, whether she wants to or not, whether she can afford to or not, and whether it's medically advisable or not. Counselors with no particular qualifications will tell the woman that abortion causes cancer and that women who get abortion suffer crippling guilt for the rest of their lives and all kind of other falsehoods and disinformation. And if the clinic has an ultrasound machine, they ain't going to use it to diagnose potential problems that might suggest the need to terminate the pregnancy. Oh, no. That ultrasound machine is there for one purpose and one purpose only, to give the counselor a prop they can use to further indoctrinate and manipulate the victim. They'll take a picture and enlarge it so the embryo looks bigger and say, Look, there's your baby. See his little head? See his little hands and feet? And thanks to the power of suggestion, the woman will think she's seeing an actual baby and that those tiny blurry blobs is actual hands and feet. She ain't going to have the medical training necessary to be able to interpret an ultrasound accurately. And the counselor sure ain't going to help her out because the counselor's there to promote a narrative that subjugates women and forces them to carry unwanted and even unwise pregnancies. And did I mention proselytizing? Crisis pregnancy centers is big-time evangelistic ministries, exploiting women's distress and vulnerability in a time of crisis in order to quote-unquote save her soul and pull her into the church. And if she don't convert and don't join whatever church is sponsoring the crisis pregnancy center, well, there's a limit to how long they's going to keep on providing her with free stuff, no matter what her needs is. So you see what Greg's doing here? He's using a precise detail, 4,000 crisis pregnancy centers, to distract attention from the important details, namely medical standards that's low or non-existent, disinformation, indoctrination, emotional manipulation, and proselytizing. He's making it sound like the CPCs is doing substantial good when they's actually making the situation worse and sometimes causing outright harm. And he calls that just the facts, man. Now at this point I was going to move on to the next topic, but I had to add a little postscript because while I was researching the requirements for setting up your very own personal crisis pregnancy center, I came across a network of CPCs called carenet.org, and just have a look at this. They has a 10-step guide for setting one up, and they'll sell it to you for $19.95 plus tax. An ebook, which costs less than a penny to produce, full of information available for free on the internet, and they want you to give them $20 for it. So we can add just a little bit of grift on top of everything else that's wrong with CPCs. Greg's next debate is with Dan Brown's fantasy thriller, The Da Vinci Code, which, Greg, my dude, it's a fantasy thriller. It's fiction. It ain't a serious claim to historical accuracy. But I reckon the greatest competition for one work of fiction is some other work of fiction, so maybe it makes sense that Greg would feel the need to defend the gospel against a novel. I'm sure he's also prepared to provide precise details to prove that they ain't no train to Hogwarts departing from platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station. Okay, maybe I'm being a little bit unfair to Greg. After all, there's apparently tons of folks who read the Gospels and think they's reading actual literal history, so it really wouldn't be all that surprising if those same folks read the Da Vinci Code and mistook it for historical fact. Not everybody has the benefit of having a skeptical worldview after all. Even so, Greg's rebuttals are kind of, well, let's just go ahead and look at them. Greg starts by claiming that Dan Brown said that they was wars between pagans and Christians that was threatening to split Rome in two. Now, it's been a long time since I read the Da Vinci Code, and I ain't going to go back and read it again. But I did find an online summary, and it said that in chapter 55 of the book, there's a historian who claims that pagans and Christians was on the verge of war. Not that they was actual armies and soldiers and such having actual military campaigns, but just that social conflict was getting a little too hot for comfort. But that ain't how Greg describes it, which makes it a little awkward when he tries his rebuttal. Quote, even a cursory analysis of this period of history reveals that there were no wars between pagans and Christians, and for a very good reason. Jesus' followers had neither armies nor the will to resist. Instead, they considered it a privilege to be martyred for Christ. End quote. But did they really, though? They certainly thought it was heroic for other Christians to be martyred for their faith, but, well, let's listen how Pliny the Younger describes Christians in the early 2nd century. Quote, others named by the informer declared that they were Christians, but then denied it, asserting that they had been but had ceased to be, some 3 years before, others many years, some as much as 25 years. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ. End quote. And he goes on to relate the information these guys gave him about how they attended Christian worship early in the morning on a certain day of the week, which confirms the fact that they was actual Christians at some point in their lives, despite their subsequent denials. So apparently they weren't all actually as happy to be martyred as popular myth makes them out to be, apart from maybe a few fanatics. Greg is correct that they weren't as aggressive as Christians is today, but that's because they were such a small minority in Roman society. It would have been suicidal to try and take over the empire by force. And like I just said, they weren't real keen on dying for Jesus, despite what apologists like to claim. Greg does better with most of the rest of his response to the Da Vinci Code on account of the fact that Dan Brown was writing a fictional thriller about a vast ancient conspiracy and was taking all kinds of liberties with the actual history of the church. So it ain't too hard to point out the discrepancies. No, Constantine didn't invent the notion that Jesus was divine. The Council of Nicaea kind of cobbled together a concept of Jesus out of the mess of conflicting doctrines that was circulating in the church at the time, and like most compromises, they weren't exactly what anybody had originally taught, including and especially the apostles. But it weren't Constantine himself that come up with it. And no, we ain't got no evidence of any lost gospels that declared Jesus to be only a mere man, although there was an early school of thought called adoptionism, which claimed that Jesus was an ordinary mortal man who was born like anybody else and later on was adopted by God as a divine son. And we do have some of those early writings, even though they ain't gospels per se. Greg does ask one question, though, that really does call for an answer. Quote, how was it physically possible for Constantine to gather up all of the handwritten copies from every nook and cranny of the Roman Empire in the 4th century and destroy the vast majority of them? End quote. And Greg's talking about the supposed Gospels that show Jesus to be an ordinary mortal man, and of course there ain't no evidence that any such Gospels existed to be destroyed. But on the bigger question of book burning, he's trying to make an argument from incredulity here, and it just ain't all that incredible. Try and find you a copy of the original works of Celsus, for example. You won't. If you do, be sure and publish a paper on it, because you'll be famous. Once the church came to power, they burned everything Celsus wrote, apart from snippets that Origen quoted in his book Against Celsus. Try to find the original writings of Arius, who argued against the deity of Jesus at the Council of Nicaea. There's a few folks that quote some of what he said, but he lost the argument and the council ordered all of his writings to be burned. Did they get it all done by the end of the 4th century? Well, maybe, maybe not, but good luck trying to find a copy that survived to today. The bottom line is that the early church was pretty keen on book burnings once they was in a position to do so, and they were pretty darn efficient once they got going. Never underestimate the destructive power of large numbers of gullible and superstitious believers. Greg would like us to think that it's somehow implausible to say that there used to be books teaching things that contradicted the church and that the church managed to destroy them all. But as a matter of documented, verifiable historical fact, that is exactly what did happen. And by the way, don't it make you curious what was in those books that was such a dangerous threat to a supposedly almighty God? One last example. Quote, Brown claims that over a period of 300 years, the Catholic Church burned 5 million witches at the stake in Europe around the 15th century. End quote. And Greg whips out his calculator and figures out that in order for this to be true, they'd have to burn 45 witches a day, 365 days a year, which would have killed 40% of the adult female population of Europe at the time. And that's some impressive math work there, maybe even impressive enough that we might forget that even one woman burned alive for supposedly being a witch is an atrocity. According to Peter Leeson and Jacob Russ in the Economic Journal, between the years 1300 and 1850, there was over 16,000 people put on trial for witchcraft, and almost 7,000 of them was put to death, which is horrific. Well, Greg don't mention that. He wants to leave us with the feeling that witch trials is overblown and that it's silly to get all worked up about it. He's using precise details in order to downplay thousands of murders committed by Christians for religious reasons. And by the way, witch trials ain't over. Fundamentalist preachers today is still ranting and raving about witches and demons and all that stuff, non-ironically, and American missionaries in sub-Saharan Africa is stirring up the same superstitious fears among rural villagers, particularly in Cameroon and other nations where you can be formally charged and brought to trial for witchcraft. This ain't just a matter of academic historical interest. But Greg don't want to hold Christianity accountable for that, and that's worth thinking about. Anyways, I think that's going to be as far as we're going to get today. If I had to pick a takeaway for this part of the chapter, I'd say it's that a half-truth is more deceptive than an outright lie. By using precise details to focus our attention on things that ain't all that important, folks like Greg can distract us from vital information that's necessary in order to draw a fair conclusion. And he's given us a number of examples already, with more to come in the remainder of the chapter. But that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time we're going to continue on in chapter 16, where Greg's going to bring up the time-honored practice of using blood libel to demonize folks and make them targets for persecution and bloodshed. And that's something we need to know how to fight back against. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.